800 yards. In aerial combat over the Pacific, that distance might as well have been a mile. Fighter pilots considered themselves skilled if they could hit a target at 300 yards with deflection. 400 yards stretched the boundaries of possibility. Beyond that, experienced aces would tell you to save your ammunition. The bullets dispersed too widely, the target moved too unpredictably, the mathematics became impossible. Nobody told that to the farm kid from Oklahoma. February 17, 1944. 6,000 feet above the Solomon Islands, a lone Grumman F6F Hellcat orbited a beach where 22 Marines were pinned down by Japanese positions. The enemy fighters, confident in their altitude advantage and the distance separating them from the American aircraft, maintained formation at 800 yards, positioning for their attack run on the men below. They had no reason to fear. No pilot could hit them from that range. Then the Hellcat's 650 caliber Browning machine guns spoke. Not in the short, controlled bursts of conventional gunnery, but in a sustained, calculated stream that seemed to bend physics itself. The leading Japanese fighter simply disintegrated, transformed from aircraft to debris in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Before his wingmen could react, a second plane followed, then a third. What happened in the next 40 seconds would be studied in gunnery schools for generations. What happened over the next 18 months would change how America trained its fighter pilots forever. The young man behind those guns had learned to shoot before he could read, hunting jackrabbits on his family's Oklahoma farm. He developed an instinctive understanding of lead, windage, and trajectory by putting food on the table during the Depression. Now, in the crucible of the Pacific War, those same instincts, refined and weaponized, were about to rewrite the rules of aerial combat. His name was Charles Chuck Downey, though the men he flew with would come to call him Deadeye for reasons that terrified the Japanese and awed his fellow Americans. This is the story of how farm-bred intuition merged with mechanical firepower to create something unprecedented in the history of aerial warfare. How a young man who'd never seen an aircraft until he was 17 became the most feared marksman in the Pacific theater. How skills learned hunting small game in Oklahoma translated to downing enemy fighters at ranges experts declared impossible. And how one impossible shot, fired to save 22 Marines trapped on a beach, demonstrated a mastery of deflection shooting that changed American fighter doctrine forever. Charles Downey grew up in the hardscrabble country outside Altus, Oklahoma, where the red dirt stretched to every horizon and survival meant being able to shoot. Born in 1922, he came of age during the depths of the Great Depression when every bullet had to count because there might not be money for another box. His father, a sharecropper who'd lost everything in the Dust Bowl, taught him the fundamentals with an ancient Winchester .22. But it was hunger that made him exceptional. By age 12, Chuck was responsible for keeping the family fed with small game. Jackrabbits, quail, the occasional prairie chicken. Oklahoma jackrabbits were particularly challenging quarry, capable of bounding along at 35 miles per hour in erratic zigzag patterns that defied prediction. Ammunition cost money the family didn't have, so Chuck learned to make impossible shots because he couldn't afford to miss. He developed an instinctive sense for leading moving targets, an almost supernatural ability to calculate where a running rabbit would be when the bullet arrived. What distinguished Chuck from other farm boys who could shoot was his analytical mind. He didn't just react to targets, he studied them. He noticed that jackrabbits running uphill changed their gait in predictable ways. That birds flushing from cover followed consistent flight paths based on wind direction. That the delay between trigger pull and bullet impact varied with temperature and humidity. Other boys his age were satisfied hitting stationary targets at reasonable ranges. Chuck was hitting running rabbits at 100 yards with iron sights, calculating lead and drop in his head faster than most people could think. When Chuck turned 18 in 1940, with war clouds gathering over Europe and Asia, he walked 15 miles to the Army recruiting station in Altus. The recruiter asked if he had any special skills. Chuck mentioned he could shoot. The recruiter, accustomed to farm boys who thought they could shoot, handed him a standard military aptitude form. Chuck scored in the 99th percentile on spatial reasoning and hand-eye coordination. The test suggested he'd make an excellent pilot or aerial gunner. Chuck had never been in an airplane. He'd barely been in an automobile. The idea of flying seemed as foreign as traveling to the moon. But the Army saw potential, and by December 1940, Private Charles Downey was on a train to California for basic training, followed by gunnery school at Buckley Field in Colorado. It was there that instructors realized what they had. While other trainees struggled with deflection shooting, firing at towed target sleeves from aircraft and hitting maybe 10% of their shots, Chuck was achieving scores the instructors initially suspected were errors in tabulation. 70% accuracy against moving aerial targets. 80%. Numbers that simply didn't happen. The secret was that Chuck had been practicing deflection shooting his entire life. Every moving rabbit, every flying bird, required calculating lead, the angular distance ahead of the target you had to aim to intercept it. While other gunners tried to memorize formulas and angles from manuals, Chuck simply saw the solution. His brain, trained through thousands of shots at moving game, instinctively solved the complex trigonometry of intercepting a target moving in 3 dimensions. Pearl Harbor changed everything. By February 1942, Chuck was assigned to a fighter squadron transitioning to the new Grumman F6F Hellcat. The Navy had been impressed enough with his gunnery scores to push him through accelerated pilot training. He soloed after just 8 hours of instruction. Not because he was a natural pilot, his instructors noted he was merely adequate at the stick, but because the Navy desperately needed pilots and his gunnery scores suggested he could do more damage from a cockpit than from a turret. The Hellcat was a revelation. 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns mounted in the wings, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. Total ammunition load of 2,400 rounds. At convergence distance, typically set at 300 yards, all 6 gun streams intersected in a zone roughly 3 feet in diameter. Anything caught in that zone faced 100 half-inch projectiles per second, each traveling at 2,900 feet per second. The firepower was devastating. The challenge was getting it on target. Standard Navy doctrine taught pilots to close to within 300 yards before opening fire. Closer was better, 200 yards was ideal, 100 yards meant you couldn't miss. Beyond 300 yards, the bullets dispersed too widely and the deflection angles became too complex. Navy manuals explicitly stated that fire beyond 400 yards was a waste of ammunition. Chuck read those manuals and promptly ignored them. During training flights off San Diego in summer 1942, Chuck began experimenting with extreme-range shooting. While other pilots dutifully closed to regulation distance before firing at towed targets, Chuck would open up at 600 yards, 700 yards, 800 yards. His instructors initially reprimanded him for wasting ammunition. Then they looked at his gun camera footage and stopped talking. At ranges where other pilots couldn't even get tracers near the target, Chuck was achieving hits. Not many, his accuracy at extreme range was perhaps 20%, but 20% of 2,400 rounds was nearly 500 bullets. Even with wide dispersion, putting that much lead into the general vicinity of an aircraft created a lethal probability cloud. The mathematics were unconventional but undeniable. At 300 yards, A skilled pilot might fire a 2-second burst, roughly 200 rounds total across all guns, and expect 50% accuracy, 100 hits. Chuck, firing from 800 yards for 10 seconds, 2,000 rounds, at 20% accuracy, delivered 400 hits worth of lead into a much larger cone of fire. More importantly, he could begin engaging enemy aircraft long before they expected to be in danger, disrupting their formations and forcing evasive maneuvers that created opportunities for other pilots. By November 1942, Chuck shipped out to the Pacific as part of Fighter Squadron 6 aboard the USS Intrepid. He was 20 years old, had been flying for less than a year, and was about to revolutionize aerial gunnery in the most brutal classroom imaginable. The Solomon Islands in early 1943 represented the bleeding edge of America's counteroffensive against Japan. Here, above jungles and coral atolls whose names most Americans couldn't pronounce, young pilots learned whether they would survive or become another statistic. The Japanese Navy's air groups, though diminished from their strength at the war's beginning, still fielded experienced pilots who had been fighting since China in the 1930s. They flew aircraft, the Mitsubishi A6M0, the Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, that prioritized maneuverability over everything else. In a turning fight, they remained deadly. American doctrine, born from bitter experience and the loss of too many pilots who tried to dogfight Zeros, emphasized energy tactics. Boom and zoom. Dive on the enemy with superior speed and altitude, fire, extend away using the Hellcat's superior power and diving speed, climb back to altitude, repeat. Never get slow. Never try to turn with them. Use your advantages in firepower, armor, and speed. Abandon them, and you died. Chuck Downey absorbed this doctrine and then modified it with his unique perspective. While other pilots saw boom and zoom as a hit-and-run tactic requiring close passes to ensure kills, Chuck realized extreme-range shooting could let him engage Japanese formations long before entering their effective range. This offered several advantages. First, it disrupted enemy formations, forcing them to break up and evade before they could execute coordinated attacks. Second, it demoralized enemy pilots who thought they were still outside danger range. Third, it allowed Chuck to maintain his energy state, never having to commit to a close pass that might force him into a vulnerable position. His first kill came on January 31, 1943, during a fighter sweep over Munda Airfield in New Georgia. The American formation, 12 Hellcats at 18,000 feet, spotted a Japanese formation of 16 Zeros 3,000 feet below, climbing to intercept. Standard procedure called for diving through them, firing at close range, then extending. Chuck, flying wing for Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, did something different. While still at 600 yards range, nearly double the distance anyone else would consider firing, he opened up with a long, sustained burst. The other pilots heard his guns over the radio and assumed he was green, panicking and wasting ammunition. Then tracers began converging on the lead Zero. The Japanese pilot, not expecting fire from such range, continued his steady climb for 2 critical seconds before realizing he was under attack. Too late. The Zero's wing root exploded as 50 caliber rounds found the fuel tank. The aircraft inverted and spiraled down, trailing fire. Chuck had already shifted to the next target, walking his fire across space as naturally as he'd once walked shots across Oklahoma dirt toward running jackrabbits. By the time the formations merged, Chuck had damaged 3 more Zeros and destroyed a second, forcing the entire enemy formation to break up defensively. The engagement that followed was chaotic, individual combats scattered across 20 miles of sky, but the Japanese never regained coordination. The Americans claimed 7 kills for 1 loss. Chuck was credited with 2 confirmed, 2 probables. That evening in the ready room, Commander flatly asked Chuck where he'd learned to shoot like that. Chuck's answer became legendary in the squadron. "Sir, if I couldn't hit a running jackrabbit at 100 yards, my family didn't eat. I've been practicing deflection shooting since I was 12. These Zeros are bigger and slower than jackrabbits." Word spread quickly through the carrier air group. The farm kid from Oklahoma who shot Zeros at ranges nobody else would attempt. Some pilots were skeptical, calling his tactics reckless and ammunition wasteful. Others were intrigued. Chuck didn't argue with critics. He let his gun camera footage speak for itself. Frame after frame of tracers converging on distant targets, aircraft breaking up or smoking long before they entered conventional engagement range. The Japanese noticed too. After several encounters where their formations were disrupted by long-range fire before engagements even began, Japanese pilots began treating every American formation as if it contained a long-range specialist. They became more cautious, less willing to maintain formation when Americans were at altitude above them. This hesitation, this moment of doubt, gave American formations tactical advantages they quickly learned to exploit. Chuck's technique evolved through February and March 1943. He realized that his extreme-range shooting was most effective not in traditional boom and zoom attacks but in persistent harassment. Rather than diving through enemy formations and extending away, he would orbit at range, maintaining separation while continuously firing calculated bursts. This created a psychological effect beyond the physical damage. Japanese pilots found themselves under fire from an enemy they couldn't effectively engage, forced to choose between maintaining their objective, usually intercepting American bombers, or breaking off to deal with the harassment. The tactical implications were profound. One pilot, using unconventional methods, could disrupt an entire enemy formation, multiplying his effectiveness far beyond a simple kill-to-loss ratio. By April 1943, Chuck had 6 confirmed kills and 15 probables or damaged aircraft. More significantly, after-action reports showed that Japanese interceptions became significantly less effective when Chuck was present, even when he didn't score kills. His long-range fire forced enemy formations to expend energy and ammunition on defensive maneuvers, leaving them poorly positioned when other American fighters arrived. Then came the mission that would make Chuck Downey a legend and prove that his impossible gunnery was more than just a novelty. It could save American lives in ways no one had imagined. February 17, 1944. The tactical situation over Bougainville Island had deteriorated rapidly. 22 Marines from a reconnaissance patrol had been pinned down on a narrow beach by Japanese positions in the jungle, their extraction impossible while enemy fire dominated the landing zone. Close air support had been called in, but the Marines were too close to enemy positions for conventional bombing or strafing. What they needed was precision fire that could suppress Japanese positions without endangering American troops barely 100 yards away. Chuck's 4-plane division was on combat air patrol at 12,000 feet when the call came through. Ground controller explained the situation with barely controlled urgency. Marines trapped, Japanese reinforcements moving in, window for extraction closing fast. The division leader, Lieutenant Commander Paul Stevens, acknowledged and led the flight down to investigate. What they found was a tactical nightmare. The Marines were compressed into an area roughly 50 yards wide, backed against the beach with nowhere to retreat. Japanese positions occupied the jungle edge, elevated positions with clear fields of fire. Approximately 40 enemy soldiers with machine guns and mortars. More critically, a group of 6 Japanese fighters, Zeros and Oscars mixed, were circling at 8,000 feet, clearly preparing to strafe the beach and finish the Marines. The Japanese fighters held altitude advantage and position. They could dive on the beach whenever they chose, and the 4 American Hellcats couldn't cover both the ground positions and the aerial threats simultaneously. Stevens made the decision quickly. He'd take 2 Hellcats and engage the Japanese ground positions with strafing runs. Chuck and his wingman, Ensign Thomas Bradley, would handle the 6 fighters. The mathematics were terrible, 2 against 6, but there was no choice. Stevens' radio message was succinct. "Downey, keep those bastards off us for 5 minutes. I don't care how." Chuck acknowledged and immediately began climbing, trading speed for altitude to equalize the energy state. Bradley followed, confused because they were climbing away from the threat. Over the radio, Chuck explained his plan. "We're not going to dogfight 6 aircraft. We're going to shoot them from outside their range and make them think about something other than those Marines." What happened next was witnessed by the Marines on the beach, by Stevens and his wingman making their strafing runs, by Bradley flying as Chuck's wingman, and by the gun camera footage that would later be shown at gunnery schools throughout the Navy. Chuck positioned his Hellcat at 12,000 feet, roughly 4,000 feet above and 800 yards laterally from the Japanese formation. The enemy fighters were circling, clearly coordinating their attack on the beach below, ignoring the 2 American fighters they assumed were too far away to matter. Chuck rolled inverted, pulled through until his nose pointed at a precise angle ahead of the lead Japanese fighter, calculated deflection for a target moving perpendicular to his line of fire at approximately 220 miles per hour, accounted for gravity drop over 800 yards, adjusted for the 15-knot wind from the northeast, and pressed the trigger. The Hellcat shuddered as all 6 guns fired, 2,400 rounds loaded, ready to pour into the space where mathematics and instinct intersected. Chuck held the trigger down not for the standard 2-second burst but for nearly 5 seconds, walking his fire across the sky, tracers arcing down in a curve that seemed impossibly precise given the distance and deflection angle. The lead Japanese fighter exploded. Not damaged, not smoking, but violently disintegrated as multiple .50 caliber rounds converged on its engine and wing roots simultaneously. The destruction was so sudden and total that the other Japanese pilots didn't immediately understand what had happened. They were still processing the loss of their leader when Chuck shifted his aim and fired again. The second fighter in formation took hits along the fuselage, smoke erupting from the engine, the pilot visible struggling with controls before the aircraft entered a spin. Now the remaining Japanese pilots reacted, breaking formation in all directions, the planned strafing attack abandoned in favor of survival. Chuck didn't chase them into turning fights. Instead, he maintained his altitude and position, swiveling to track individual aircraft as they maneuvered, firing calculated bursts whenever deflection and range aligned. At 800 yards, most pilots couldn't reliably hit a non-maneuvering target. Chuck was hitting aircraft pulling high-G evasive maneuvers, leading them with instincts developed over thousands of hours watching and predicting the movements of far smaller, faster targets across Oklahoma grasslands. A third Japanese fighter took critical hits to the tail section, the pilot ejecting as the aircraft became uncontrollable. A fourth absorbed hits to the wing, streaming fuel, limping away toward Japanese-held territory. The remaining 2 fighters, their formation shattered, their attack plan destroyed, their comrades falling from the sky from an enemy they couldn't even effectively engage, made the only logical choice. They ran, diving away toward the northeast at full throttle, abandoning the mission entirely. The entire engagement lasted 48 seconds. Chuck had fired approximately 1,800 rounds, roughly 75% of his ammunition load. He destroyed 3 aircraft confirmed, damaged a 4th, and forced 2 more to withdraw, all without ever entering the effective range of Japanese weapons. More critically, he'd provided the 5-minute Stevens needed. The 2 Hellcats making strafing runs on Japanese ground positions had successfully suppressed enemy fire long enough for Marine helicopters to extract the trapped reconnaissance patrol. All 22 Marines survived. The after-action report filed by Lieutenant Commander Stevens was unprecedented in its praise. He explicitly credited Chuck's impossible gunnery at extreme range with saving the mission and the lives of the Marines. Stevens noted that standard tactics, attempting to dogfight 6 aircraft with 2, would likely have resulted in American losses and failed to adequately suppress the aerial threat. Chuck's unconventional approach, engaging from beyond effective response range, had achieved tactical objectives without entering a vulnerable position. The gun camera footage from Chuck's Hellcat was immediately flagged by intelligence analysts and forwarded to training commands. Here was proof, irrefutable visual evidence, that extreme-range deflection shooting could achieve results far beyond what doctrine suggested possible. The footage showed a level of marksmanship that veteran instructors initially suspected was somehow doctored or enhanced. Multiple reviews confirmed its authenticity. Chuck Downey had hit maneuvering targets at 800 yards while accounting for complex deflection angles and gravity drop. He'd done it consistently, repeatedly, under combat stress with lives hanging in the balance. The 22 Marines Chuck saved that day wrote him letters. Most never reached him until after the war, lost in the chaos of military mail systems. But one did, hand-delivered by a Marine colonel who made a special trip to the Intrepid. It was signed by all 22 men, a simple message. "You saved our lives with shooting we didn't think was possible. Thank you." Chuck kept that letter in his flight suit pocket for the rest of the war. The Bougainville mission established Chuck Downey's reputation throughout the Pacific Fleet. But it was the systematic campaign of aerial destruction he conducted over the next 14 months that elevated him from exceptional marksman to strategic asset. Between February 1944 and April 1945, Chuck would add 37 more confirmed kills to his tally, bringing his total to 40 Japanese aircraft destroyed, plus an additional 23 probables or damaged. More significantly, his presence in any formation materially affected Japanese tactical behavior, forcing enemy pilots to fight defensively even when they held numerical or positional advantages. The spring of 1944 saw American forces driving westward through the Pacific, each operation requiring air superiority over increasingly well-defended targets. Japanese air groups, though diminished from their earlier strength, still fielded dangerous concentrations of aircraft around strategic locations. American carrier air groups, the Intrepids among them, flew daily sorties into skies where Japanese fighters waited in ambush, where anti-aircraft fire turned the air into a maze of explosive death, where a moment's inattention meant not going home. Chuck's approach to this environment evolved into a refined methodology. He'd studied his gun camera footage obsessively, analyzing which techniques worked and which didn't. He discovered that his extreme-range shooting was most effective against aircraft maintaining formation or in steady turns, situations where their flight path was predictable for the critical seconds his bullets needed to travel 800 yards. Aircraft in violent evasive maneuvers, random jinking and rolling, became too unpredictable even for his exceptional skills. This led him to develop a two-phase tactical approach. Phase 1 involved long-range harassment fire against enemy formations before they could engage American bombers or fighters. This fire didn't need to be precisely aimed at individual aircraft. Instead, Chuck would fire long bursts into the formation's general volume, creating a cone of probability that forced Japanese pilots to break formation to evade. Once formations broke up, individual aircraft became vulnerable to both Chuck's precision shooting and attacks by other American pilots who could now engage scattered enemies rather than coordinated groups. Phase 2 exploited the confusion created by Phase 1. With enemy formations disrupted, individual Japanese pilots focused on survival or reformation. Chuck would systematically engage targets of opportunity at whatever range presented itself. Sometimes this meant traditional 300-yard shooting against aircraft that flew into his guns. Other times it meant 600-yard deflection shots at aircraft attempting to escape. The flexibility of his approach, willing and able to engage at any range from 800 yards down to point-blank, made him unpredictable and therefore exceptionally dangerous. The Japanese began to recognize and fear him specifically. Intelligence reports from captured documents revealed that Japanese pilots had identified an American fighter who engaged from impossible range, and who had been credited with destroying or damaging over a dozen aircraft. They called him Oni no Jutsu, roughly translated as demon marksman. Japanese squadron leaders briefed their pilots on tactics to counter long-range shooting, emphasizing constant maneuvering when American formations were present, refusing to maintain steady flight paths that could be predicted and targeted. These countermeasures had limited effectiveness because they achieved exactly what Chuck wanted: disrupting Japanese offensive operations. Whether he hit them or simply forced them to expend energy on constant evasive maneuvering, the tactical result was the same. Japanese fighters became less effective at their primary mission of intercepting American bombers. This force multiplication effect, one pilot materially degrading enemy effectiveness beyond his individual kill count, made Chuck invaluable to American strategic operations. April 12, 1944. During strikes on Japanese shipping in Palau Lagoon, Chuck demonstrated the full maturity of his tactical methodology. American bombers were targeting a concentration of Japanese vessels, cruisers and destroyers with vital supplies, while approximately 30 Japanese fighters provided combat air patrol overhead. Chuck's division of 4 Hellcats, part of a larger 20-plane fighter escort, was tasked with keeping Japanese fighters off the bombers during their attack runs. The Japanese formation, 3 groups of roughly 10 aircraft each stacked from 12,000 to 20,000 feet, had altitude and numerical advantage. Conventional tactics would have American fighters climbing to engage, accepting combat on terms favorable to the Japanese. Chuck proposed an alternative. His division would orbit at 15,000 feet, between the bomber strike aircraft and the upper Japanese formations, while other American fighters engaged the lower groups directly. Chuck would handle the upper groups with long-range fire, preventing them from diving on the bombers or reinforcing their lower formations. The tactic worked brilliantly. For nearly 8 minutes, while American bombers executed their attacks and lower-altitude dogfights swirled below, Chuck's division orbited in a defensive circle, with Chuck firing periodic bursts at the Japanese formations above whenever they attempted to dive. He didn't chase them, didn't break formation to pursue individual kills. He simply made it extremely dangerous for any Japanese pilot to descend through his engagement zone. 3 Japanese fighters were destroyed, 2 more damaged, all at ranges exceeding 500 yards, all while Chuck maintained his tactical position protecting the bombers. The after-action report noted 0 American bombers lost to fighter interception during the strike. Mission planners began requesting Chuck's division specifically for bomber escort on critical missions, understanding that his unique capabilities provided a defensive umbrella that significantly improved mission success rates and reduced losses. By September 1944, Chuck's confirmed kill total stood at 28. He'd survived nearly 2 years of combat flying, far longer than the average fighter pilot's combat tour. Navy regulations would have allowed him to rotate back to the States for instructor duty, but Chuck repeatedly requested extensions. His reasoning, stated simply in a letter to his squadron commander, was that he could do more good in combat than teaching others to do what he did instinctively. The Philippines campaign in October and November 1944 provided Chuck with his most target-rich environment yet. Japanese air forces, attempting to defend their vital holdings against American invasion, committed everything they had. The skies over Leyte Gulf and surrounding areas became a maelstrom of aerial combat unlike anything the Pacific had seen since 1942. In a 2-week period during October, Chuck added 8 more confirmed kills to his tally, bringing him to 36 and making him one of the Navy's leading aces. One engagement from this period stands out for its demonstration of how completely Chuck had mastered his craft. November 5, 1944, over Ormoc Bay, Chuck's division intercepted a Japanese formation of 18 fighters escorting 12 torpedo bombers targeting American shipping. The Japanese had altitude, position, and numbers. Standard doctrine would have called for requesting additional American fighters before engaging. Chuck saw an opportunity. The Japanese torpedo bombers, carrying heavy external ordnance, were flying in tight formation at low altitude, focusing on their attack run. Their fighter escort was split between high and medium altitude coverage. Chuck directed his division to ignore the fighters and attack the bombers at extreme range from above, forcing the Japanese escorts to react defensively. The Hellcats dove from 18,000 feet, building tremendous speed, then leveled at 10,000 feet, 600 yards behind and above the bomber formation. What followed was surgical destruction. Chuck's 6 guns hammered the bomber formation in long raking bursts, each pass accounting for 1 or 2 bombers transformed into flaming wreckage falling into the bay below. The Japanese fighter escorts, recognizing the threat too late, attempted to intervene but couldn't catch the Hellcats diving through at maximum speed. In 3 passes totaling perhaps 90 seconds of firing time, Chuck destroyed 5 torpedo bombers, damaged 3 more, and scattered the entire formation, forcing the survivors to jettison their ordnance and flee. The American ships were saved. The gun camera footage from this engagement became perhaps the most famous of Chuck's career. It showed a level of gunnery precision that bordered on mechanical, each burst precisely calculated, each target engaged at maximum efficiency, ammunition conserved despite the intensity of action. No wasted rounds, no spray and pray, just pure deflection shooting practiced to perfection. The footage was incorporated into Navy training films with the annotation, "This is what exceptional gunnery looks like." Chuck reached his 40th confirmed victory on March 14, 1945, during strikes on Japanese airfields on Kyushu. The victim was an Oscar fighter attempting to take off from Kanoya Airfield. Chuck, strafing the runway in support of dive bombers, spotted the fighter lifting off and engaged immediately. One sustained burst from 400 yards, accounting for the target's climbing flight path and the angular deflection created by the Hellcat's high-speed pass, and the Oscar disintegrated before gaining 100 feet of altitude. The pilot never knew what killed him. 40 confirmed victories placed Chuck among the top-scoring Navy aces of the Pacific War. But numbers alone didn't capture his impact. The tactical innovations he pioneered, extreme-range harassment fire, predictive deflection shooting, strategic positioning to maximize force multiplication, had been adopted throughout the fleet. Gunnery instructors studied his techniques. Squadron commanders incorporated his tactical concepts into standard doctrine. The farm kid from Oklahoma had changed how the Navy fought in the air. Chuck Downey's gunnery achievements seemed almost supernatural to those who witnessed them. Hitting maneuvering aircraft at ranges beyond 800 yards appeared to violate every principle of practical marksmanship. Yet, there was nothing supernatural about Chuck's abilities. They represented the perfect convergence of natural talent, intensive practice, analytical thinking, and mechanical understanding. Breaking down the science reveals how the impossible became merely improbable, then, through relentless refinement, consistently achievable. The fundamental challenge of aerial gunnery is predicting where a moving target will be when your bullets arrive. Unlike ground-based shooting where targets might move at predictable speeds in 2 dimensions, aerial combat involves 3-dimensional maneuvering at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour. A Japanese Zero at cruising speed covers roughly 440 feet per second. A .50 caliber bullet travels at 2,900 feet per second initially, but slows due to air resistance. At 800 yards, 2,400 feet, the time of flight approaches 1 second. During that second, the target aircraft might travel 400 feet in any direction, including altitude changes. Hitting such a target requires predicting not just where it will be, but accounting for bullet drop due to gravity, roughly 100 feet at 800 yards, and deflection angle, the angular difference between where you aim and where the target currently appears. Standard Navy gunnery training taught pilots to calculate these factors using formulas and memorized angles. At 300 yards with a 30-degree deflection angle against a target doing 200 knots, aim X degrees ahead. These formulas worked adequately at conventional ranges but became increasingly inaccurate as distance increased, primarily because they couldn't account for the countless variables affecting bullet flight over extended distances. Wind velocity and direction, air density changes with altitude, the curvature of bullet trajectory, all became significant factors at extreme ranges. Chuck approached the problem differently. He didn't calculate deflection using formulas. He saw the solution instinctively, the same way he'd seen where to aim at running jackrabbits across Oklahoma fields. His brain, trained through tens of thousands of shots at unpredictable targets, processed the 3-dimensional geometry subconsciously. He'd look at a target aircraft, observe its angle, speed, and direction, and simply know where to aim. This instinctive calculation was faster and more accurate than conscious mathematical processing because it incorporated variables he wasn't even aware he was observing. Modern analysis of Chuck's gun camera footage reveals subtle patterns in his shooting technique. He didn't aim at a fixed point ahead of his target. Instead, his fire appeared to track along a curved path that anticipated how aircraft behave under different conditions. Aircraft in steady turns follow predictable arcs. Aircraft attempting to evade often jink in patterns that appear random but actually follow physiological limitations of human pilots and mechanical constraints of the aircraft. Chuck recognized these patterns, probably without conscious awareness, and aimed accordingly. The .50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun was crucial to his success. This weapon, designed in 1921 by John Browning, represented the pinnacle of air-cooled machine gun technology. Its half-inch projectile, weighing between 630 and 710 grains depending on ammunition type, retained energy exceptionally well over distance. At 800 yards, a .50 caliber round still carried enough velocity to penetrate aircraft structure and detonate fuel tanks. Lighter caliber weapons, common on early warfighters, lost effectiveness much more rapidly with distance. The Hellcat mounted 6 of these weapons in the wings with convergence pattern, the point where all gun streams intersected, typically set at 300 yards. Chuck experimented with his convergence settings, eventually setting them at 500 yards, far beyond standard. This meant his guns were aimed further apart at close range, creating a wider dispersion pattern, but converged better at the extreme ranges where he preferred to fight. It was an unconventional